Hi, everybody. Tim Baker here. I just want to give you a short introduction to some very interesting research looking at teams, and probably a lot of this research, as a lot of research might be quite obvious, but I think it's very, very important that we understand what makes high-performing teams. And I think a lot of people have misunderstandings about how they go about this. And if you think about it, there are two aspects of teams. There's the task, which is obviously, the product or the service that you deliver. And there's the relationships, which of course is the working relationships and communication piece between team members. And it's actually the latter that makes all the difference. And if you look at most mishaps and misunderstandings that happen in teams, it's usually a result of the relationship dimension, not the task dimension. So obviously, if you get the relationship dimension right, it will improve the task dimension. So let me share my screen and we can launch into a couple of slides and look at this research in a little bit more detail. Now, this work comes from my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And so this is one dimension that's very, very important in team development. So let's have a look at this in a little bit more detail. First of all, those who may not know who I am, I'm an author, as you can see. I'm a keynote speaker. I run workshops. I'm an executive coach. I also play rugby, still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. Mind you, that's more a social activity, as you can imagine, at my age than a sort of an athletic pursuit. But nevertheless, that's a little bit about me. Let's launch into a couple of nice testimonials about my book. I did go and find out and investigate the All Blacks and what made them such an effective team. And it was a very enlightening experience. And a couple of the All Blacks and Wallabies, I might say, gave me some lovely testimonials about my book, including the Commissioner of Queensland Police, Katarina Carroll. So there's some nice testimonials about the book there, and one from Nick Farr-Jones, who had some great things to say, who was a former Wallaby great, who happened to be the successful captain of our World Cup victory several years ago. So let's launch into what I'm going to talk about. I guess the big objection is it even possible to have a high-performing team in the world of work? Now, we know high-performing teams happen in the world of sport, no question about that. But what about the world of work? Is it possible? Yes, it is. I work across 21 industries, and I have to say that I do come across high-performing teams. And the thing about high-performing teams is they all have one thing in common, and that is they have the relationship dimension worked out. And that's the common trait that I find. Obviously, they've got a high performance. They do produce great results and all the rest. But at the end of the day, if you said, what's the common denominator? I would say it's the relationship dimension that really they have got that piece worked out. Unfortunately, when we inherit a team as a team leader, what we will often do is we might do the obligatory day of training or whatever, and then we forget about the relationship dimension and just launch into what we're there for, which is obviously to produce the product or the tasks or the services that we're there for. So I would suggest to you, if you can get one thing out of this short session this morning, is you need to spend more time on the relationship dimension. And let me share some research that will demonstrate that to you. I just want to talk a little bit more about that task and relationship dimension. And then I want to talk about the 3 key elements that the research demonstrates are critically important to team success. And I think you'll find that very interesting. And I've got a special offer for you at the end of the presentation because you've taken up your valuable time to spend with me. Okay, so as I said earlier, there is a task and a relationship dimension to teamwork. And I'll just unpack that a little bit, but at the end of the day, we can look at teams through the prism of the tasks that they do or the relationships they have. And if you think about it a little further, up the top here, we have the task, which is obviously what we do, so why we exist. And then the relationship dimension can be broken up into 2 categories. Down here, we have the team and the individual. So if you look at the individual, it's really about catering for the individual needs and the interests and the motivations of your team members. Human beings are always different. They always have different priorities, different preferences, different needs. And a good leader, of course, accommodates that. But that's only one aspect of it, and that's your working relationship with each team member. But don't forget, of course, when the team comes together, you have a collective responsibility, and that's ultimately about maintaining harmony and balance and collaboration with the team itself. So ultimately, you can see it's the more complex aspect of teamwork just by the fact that there are two parts to it. But also, it's interesting, isn't it, that we only spend a very small amount of time, if at all, on this whole relationship dimension, when in fact it's the most complex part of teamwork and also the one that contributes most to high performance in teams. So let's have a look at this. There's a number of models out there, and this model is quite an interesting one. And you can see down the bottom on the horizontal axis, it's concern for production. And you could substitute the word production with task. And then the vertical axis is concern for people, and you could substitute the word people with relationship. So this is a model that shows you that there are four particular, or actually five particular approaches you can take to teamwork. So in the bottom there, you've got what they call the impoverished leadership, and that is where it's low on task or concern for production, and it's low on people. So in this dimension, what you have is a reluctant team leader. They don't want to be team leader. They might be team leader in name, but they're not really, team leader in any other way. And so for example, it might be in a laboratory where one of those people happens to be the supervisor in the laboratory, but this person is far more comfortable doing the technical aspect of their work. So obviously we don't want to be in that position if we're a team leader. So if we go across to the right-hand side, this is high on task and low on relationship. So this is the taskmaster. This is the person who is always pushing to achieve results in the team. And often it's at the sacrifice of the relationships in the team. These people are the ones that want to, get on and get the job done no matter what. Now, in an emergency, in a crisis, that's absolutely vital, because you don't have time for building relationships. And quite frankly, the crisis is right in front of you. You have to deal with it. So the task, dimension, or that particular approach is very good in that situation. Now, if we go up to the team management one in the top right-hand corner, you would assume that that's the ideal position to be in, because it's high on production and high on people. But the truth of the matter is, different situations will require different interventions. So it's not necessarily, and it's not necessarily sustainable, let alone is it necessarily the best way to go. But I mean, given a choice, it probably is. And then you've got the one that I find the most interesting is the country club dimension in the bottom top left-hand corner. And that's where there's a high concern for people, but a low concern for production. In other words, people enjoy coming to work for the relationship aspect. They might talk about their weekends and they enjoy the friendship and the camaraderie, but nothing really gets done. And so, I'm not a member of a country club, but I'm assuming that, that's how things roll in country clubs. So that's a good definition of that. Now, you might say, well, I'd never want to be in that position, but there are times when that's very relevant. For example, where the team has a low morale or there's a fracture in the relationships in the team, it might be important for you as the team leader to mend those bridges and to build those relationships, because quite frankly, until you do that, there's very little else you can do. So there is a time and a place for that. And then, of course, the middle of the road is, I think, the place to be, because if you're in the middle of the road, you can actually fluctuate to each of those different quadrants. And I think that's the place to be. So it's always balancing task and relationship. depending on what's in front of you and what you need to be doing. Now, in the impoverished dimension on the bottom left-hand corner, that's reasonable only in circumstances where you have a team that's highly competent. So they know what they're doing. They're extremely good. And so, of course, being impoverished in that sense might mean just letting people get on and do their job. So that's another way of looking at it. Now, let's look at the research. Now, this research that I'm going to share with you comes from Sandy Pentland's research at MIT. And basically what Sandy Pentland did do is he was very interested in what the role communication played and how critical it was to team success. And what he did, which was very interesting, is he looked at a number of teams. He looked at a high-performing team, he looked at a mediocre team, and he looked at a low-performing team. Now, you might say, how did he measure that? Well, this was in a commercial environment, and it was looking at productivity, so the number of sales. And what he did is he gave these teams a little lapel type, little badge, little bit of technology here that people would wear for 6 weeks. And this would record their interactions with their team members for 6 weeks. Now, it wouldn't necessarily record what they said, but more about who they spoke to and, what the sort of patterns of communication were. So people had to wear this around for 6 weeks. Now, you can imagine people would have been very conscious in the early stages that I've got this little lapel on, so I've got to be very careful and mindful of who I talk to. But after a while, of course, people forgot about it and just got on with their normal course of action as they'd go through that. And what he was really looking at were the communication patterns between high-performing, low-performing, and mediocre teams. So that's really what he was very interested in. And it was really the way that people communicated in informal settings, which was more important than in formal settings. Now, that's the first interesting thing about this. It's the corridor conversations that make the big difference. So most of you, of course, would have team meetings. And, they're very formal occasions. You sit down in your group, there's an agenda, you go through a normal pattern each week or every fortnight. And what Sandy Pentland worked out was it was more about what happened outside the meeting room that made the difference. And what he found was that the best predictors of productivity were actually 2 concepts. That was team energy and engagement outside the formal meeting. So I'll unpack what energy and engagement means in a moment. But according to Pentland, he was able to calculate that the energy and engagement accounted for about 1/3 of the variation in dollar terms of team productivity, which is significant if you're working in the private sector, for example. But it would be no different perhaps working in the public sector or not-for-profits. The reality is that you may not have been able to measure it in a quantitative way, but it would still be relevant. Now, it does pose an interesting question, a paradox, if you like, and that is, does a high-performing team promote better communication between team members, or does better communication build high performance? So what comes first, the chicken or the egg? And that's an interesting paradox, because the argument is unless there's good communication going on in a team, the team won't achieve high performance. But then again, high performance can improve communication significantly. So it's an interesting question. Anyway, Pentland did answer that. So the question here that I find fascinating from his research is that it seems almost absurd that how we actually communicate could be so much more important to success than what we communicate. Just think about that for a minute. It's not so much what we say, but the patterns of interaction as to how we say it that can make the big difference. So let me talk about that a little bit more in detail. Basically, from his research, he found that there were 5 key factors in team achievement. And the first factor that he found was that everyone in the high-performing team actually contributed equally in casual interactions. So remember, we're talking about outside the meeting room here. We're talking about in the corridor. And what he found, because he could remember measure it with this little lapel instrument, he could actually measure the patterns of communication. And what he found was that in the high-performing team, everybody was engaged in these corridor conversations. And he found that the mediocre and the low-performing team weren't doing that to the same degree. The second key thing that he found was that meaning, and just on that first point, and I think it's really important, you know, and I know that when we often get our teams together and we have a, face-to-face meeting, or even if we're doing it online, that usually one or two people dominate the meeting. And that means that a couple of other people in the meeting don't say too much. And so we all know that that's a challenge to get everybody to contribute equally. But that's not a challenge in a high-performing team. Everybody actually feels comfortable contributing equally, and that's the key point. The second thing he found was that meaningful conversations occurred in face-to-face encounters with vibrance and energy. So there was a lot of enthusiasm there. There wasn't what Linda Grattan calls dehydrated conversation. Basically, people were talking about meaningful things. And I don't mean deep and meaningful things. I'm talking about things in relation to the work that needed to be done and expressing their own point of view and putting things on the table when they need to be discussed. The third key thing he found was that team members communicate with one another without the need of the team leader. So in the high-performing team, what usually occurred was that a couple of people would get together, they would make a decision, and ultimately then they would inform out of courtesy the team leader, but the decision had already been made. So in the mediocre and the low-performing teams, people were too reliant on the team leader, and they went to the team leader to actually defer the decision to the team leader. Whereas in the high-performing teams, the leader would actually not be needed in that case. The fourth interesting insight he came up with was that the high-performing teams did engage in more one-on-one conversations with each other than the other two teams. So he found that the patterns of communication were not only equal between the team members, but also that there were more of those conversations going on in the corridor than there were in the low-performing or the mediocre team. So that's interesting, isn't it, that there were more conversations going on, and those conversations were richer conversations, and they weren't conversations dominated by one or two people. And finally, he found, interestingly enough, that the team members themselves in the high-performing teams would feel very comfortable networking beyond the team. In other words, they'd look after the stakeholder engagement piece. What I mean by that is they would proactively go out of their way to open up the lines of communication with the people that they required in order to get their work done. Whereas in the mediocre and the low-performing teams, what actually happened was that the leader was the one that would open those doors to stakeholder engagement. So it's interesting, isn't it, that these are the characteristics that are critically important and do shape what we mean by a high-performing team. So there were three elements that he decided were critically important. And these are the three elements, of course, that are critical to a team's success. So the first element is energy, and what he defines energy as the frequency and value of conversations between team members. So energy is about the number of conversations that go on and the quality of the conversations in terms of the nature of what is being discussed. So we do know in low-performing teams and mediocre teams, there's very superficial interaction where someone will say, how are you? How was your weekend? And off you go. Now, that still happens in a high-performing team. It's just that they might discuss it in a bit more detail. and then they'd move on to the things that were critically important to the team's success. So that's what energy means. But what about engagement? Engagement is the distribution of energy amongst team members. So this was the pattern that I talked about, where high-performing teams would interact with each other, and there wouldn't be one or two dominant players in the team, that everybody had skin in the game, everybody was interested in contributing, and everybody did contribute according to his own research in this little lapel instrument that he used. Now, the third element of a high-performing team is that the high-performing teams would communicate regularly beyond the team environment to their stakeholders. Now, that is, of course, that would be music to your ears if you weren't working in a high-performing team, if you knew that your team members were actively engaged in building up good relationships with the people that your team relied on to give you the resources and information you needed to do your job. In other words, stakeholders. So they're the three characteristics. So you can see clearly that the relationship dimension is critically important to any team success. And I'll just go back for a moment before I wrap up and finish that point. So how do you go about this? Well, I think the first thing I would suggest to you, I think the first thing I would say is that what you need to do is you need to spend more time on the relationship dimension of teams. Now, look, a simple thing to do, and I say this all the time when I'm with groups, a simple thing to do would be to look at your team meetings as 50% reporting and 50% conversation. So in other words, you might think, well, most of our meetings are about, work in progress, how we're achieving things. That's fine. You've got to do a bit of that. I have no doubts about that. It's obviously important. You need to know where people are up to, and everyone else needs to know where people are up to. But you shouldn't dominate the meeting just with that. So you might want to, do some things around getting the team engaged in problem solving, maybe look at the culture of the team. There are so many interesting things you can do where you can get your team engaged in the team itself. A simple process. You could go around the team and ask each team member on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being high, 1 being low, how do you rate our current teamwork? And of course, you ask them why, and you have a conversation about that. And I'm assuming that they won't all be 5s. And if the case is they aren't all 5s, then you can have a conversation about how you can improve teamwork. Simple things like that can make a huge difference, because I think these are the things we don't discuss. And the reason for that is very simple. We're rewarded, aren't we? We're rewarded very much for getting the task dimension done. But as you can see from the research, it's actually the relationship dimension that makes all the difference. So if we don't spend enough time doing that, then what's going to happen is the task will suffer because the relationships aren't where they need to be. So in other words, if you want better task accomplishment in a team, the place to start is to actually work, ironically, on the relationship dimension. And that way you will achieve less misunderstandings. You'll achieve more proactive and independent judgment from team members, and you'll be required less and less to put out bushfires and solve problems. And that's exactly how you would want to be. So that's a good start. And if you start there, then people may start having these conversations outside the team meeting, which will make all the difference as well. Okay, just going back to my slides for a moment. So they're the 3 elements. Now, next week, those of you who are regular attendees would understand this, but next week I've got another one of these sessions. I am changing tack a little bit next week. I'm going to talk about the 5 conversations framework, and I'm basically talking about that as a new approach to performance reviews. And I'm going to give you an overview of what that looks like. And it's a very popular framework, I'm proud to say. Many companies and organizations around the world are using it. And I do feature this in my book, The Future of Human Resources, Unlocking Human Potential. So you can certainly, you can certainly get a quick overview about what that's all about next Friday. And you can see that all you've got to do is click on that link as you did today. And of course, you'll register and away you go. Now, the other thing I said, a special offer, my book Winning Teams is available and you can purchase it on Amazon if you choose. But if you'd like to get a copy for a reduced price of $25, which will include postage, just send me an email by the close of business today and I'd be happy to send you a copy, and I'll organise payment with you and I'll sign the book for you, and it'll have a lot of different interesting techniques and insights into how you can build the relationship dimension of the team. And probably the highlight of the book is the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. What are they? And what are some of the strategies and techniques that you can use to implement those? So folks, I'll finish up there. So thank you for the opportunity of working with you today. I hope, we can see you next week. I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording fairly soon. And of course, register for next week and think carefully about purchasing a copy of my book at discount price. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. And I certainly, in this part of the world, it's a public holiday on Monday, so people can have a bit of a longer weekend. So I hope you have a great weekend and hopefully we catch you next week. Thanks, everyone. All the best and goodbye.